Well, hi everyone. I'm Lindsay Johnson, Fiscal Sponsorship and Communications Manager at Southeast Uplift. Thank you for joining us today. We do have a few more trainings coming up. We have some in April and May, so be sure to check our website and our social media for more info on those. Today's session on event planning, a step-by-step guide, will be presented by Diane L. Odeh. This session is being recorded and will be shared. You're welcome to have your camera on or off, whatever's most comfortable for you. We have enabled captions, and if you have any additional accessibility needs, feel free to post those in the chat. Now I'm going to hand the mic over to our presenter, Diane, to introduce herself.
All right, thanks, Lindsay. So, hello, it's good to see some of you again. It's good to see some new faces. Thank you for joining me today. Today, we're going to talk about event planning step by step. So, what steps go into event planning? So, let's get into it. So, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay, so yeah, it's event planning, a step-by-step guide. So about me, just very briefly, yeah, I'm Diane. I work with nonprofit organizations and neighborhood associations, and I also have a lot of experience planning events. I've planned 50 plus events during my career so far. And also I love to plan events as a hobby. I love throwing a good party, a good fundraiser. So it's a personal kind of passion of mine. So I wanted to know about you all. So you can either say it or type it in the chat. Just say your name and affiliation and what you hope to get out of this workshop.
I could share Molly Skeen, and I'm with Sunnyside East Village, and we're a very small startup nonprofit making plans to connect with villages Northwest after a while. And so we've started to have some little events, and we're just not really attracting very many participants. So I'm here to learn.
Great. Thank you, Molly. And if anyone would like to share, feel free to either share verbally or share it in the chat. Okay, so we'll go ahead and just move forward as those chats roll in. So, okay, so like I said, we're gonna do a step-by-step guide. So to event planning. So basically what we're going to be looking at is essentially what I consider 4 phases of event planning. So you have creating the event. So like essentially like coming up with the event. Then once you figure that out, you plan the event, then you carry out the event, and then there are some considerations you need to make post-event. Thank you, Yamungu. You're with UCCO. You're interested in learning about what I'm presenting. Great. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it. Okay, so basically, these are all bullet points telling you what to consider. We're going to get deep into some of these, and some we're not going to get as deep into because they're kind of self-evident. So when you're creating an event, generally, it's important to form a group about 4 to 6 months before you start an event. This could be longer, this could be shorter, depending on what type of event you're planning. So when you form this event planning group, from there, you clarify group member roles and responsibilities. You determine the goal of the event and your target audience. Then from there, you determine the location and the date and time of the event and create an event budget. So essentially how much you're willing to spend. When you're planning the event, so in the months leading up, so it's a little vague here because you may have 4 months to plan, you may have 2 months to plan, you may have 8 months to plan. So, think, pay less attention to the time, more attention to the steps involved. So from there, you finalize the activities that you will be doing during the event. Then you'll need to figure out what volunteer needs you have. So essentially, what kinds of tasks need volunteers involved. Then you'll recruit those volunteers. Then at this point, it's really important to start tracking your costs. So what are you spending your money on? And ordering supplies and marketing your event. Then as in the days leading up to the event, so when you're thinking about carrying out the actual event, it's important to start maintaining communication with your volunteers. So the people who are contributing to the event, also make sure that you're confirming your arrangements with any vendors that you have hired, any spaces that you're renting, etc. Then post-event, we'll get into it, but you need to make sure you're paying any outstanding invoices, sending thank yous. For those of you who are familiar with my volunteer management workshop, sending thank yous is a very important part of expressing appreciation and retaining volunteers. Then you'll post pictures of the event, so documenting the event throughout. And then we're going to talk about this, but it's important to then reflect and evaluate reflect on the event and evaluate how you think it went. So we're going to start with phase 1, creating the event. So once you have your committee formed, so like I said, I'm skipping over some. So let's think about, you have formed your committee. So it's important to really be clear on who's doing what. So what's their role and responsibilities in the context of the event you're planning. So here are some common roles that people should fulfill, and there may be some missing. So feel free to type in the chat any that you can think of that I may be missing. But first off, you need someone in charge of supplies. So what kinds of supplies do you need to carry out this event? So that person would be in charge of determining that and ordering that. Then you need somebody to think about marketing. So if you have invitations, if you need to perform outreach, having someone who has that as their dedicated task would be really important. Then there's logistics. So when we talk about logistics, it means things like technology needs. So what kind of technology do you need at your event? Do you need microphones? Do you need amplifiers? Are you recording the event? If so, who's going to manage that? So, and then in relation to that, physical space needs. So the logistics of how many people are expected to be there, how many tables and chairs do you need, things like that. Then there's someone who should be in charge of food and beverage. So that would be someone who helps plan the menu and is in charge of coordinating catering needs. Then you have activities. So someone who is more focused on planning the logistics behind different activities that may happen at your event. And finally, someone in charge of volunteer management. So in other words, someone who's coordinating the tasks that volunteers are working on. So in the planning phase, it's also important to consider the goal of the event. So here are just 5 general types of goals of events. So first goal is fellowship/fun. So a lot of community organizations, a lot of neighborhood associations will organize events that are really just meant to strengthen bonds in the community. So that is a goal of an event, and that's a perfectly fine goal. Now, some other goals that may be relevant to your event is convening. So that's when you gather key interested parties related to an issue. So this could be a political issue, it could be a social issue. It could involve perhaps elected officials, maybe not, maybe experts. So it's just a little bit more serious and I would say task oriented than something that you're doing just for the sake of fun. Another type of event is engaging. So essentially community engagement. So gathering people with the ultimate goal of asking for their feedback on things. So this could be issue specific. It could not be issue specific. It could just be, hey, how are things going in this community? Other event, another goal is information sharing. So the goal of those would be things like a town hall meeting to share information about something, maybe the rollout of perhaps a new district is a very recent example. But yeah, an event where the goal is to share information, educate groups on something. And then finally, fundraising is an often often a goal within nonprofit organizations. So to raise money for a cause or organization. Can you all in the audience think of any other goals of an event that you may be thinking of?
I've been involved with organizations that have events related to trying to recruit volunteers. It
Oh, okay.
probably comes under one of these categories, but I'm not sure which. Maybe engaging or
Yeah.
convening, one or the
No,
other.
I like that. Like essentially a recruitment event, it sounds.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, okay, cool. I would say, yeah, I mean, you could pull from different elements of this, but I would say, yeah, recruitment could be its own goal. Thank you, Molly. All right, so some things to consider when you're setting the actual time and date of your event is you need to consider your target audience. So, are you trying to appeal to families? Are you trying to appeal to a certain group, like a certain community? Are you trying to appeal to, well, yeah, those are enough. And so like considering, are there days and times that are better for that group? So for instance, if you're trying to have a lot of families at an event, it's very likely you would probably try to avoid weekdays. You would, and I mean families with children, so you'd probably try to avoid weekdays. You'd probably try to avoid meal times. You may want to you may want to aim for a weekend, maybe a Saturday. So maybe not too early, not too late. And it's important to also consider avoiding major holidays and days of rest. So in some situations, there are some religions that have certain days of rest where they don't engage. So if you schedule your meeting or your event on that day, then you're kind of already closing off an entire group of people. And when I say major holidays, I'm talking about holidays all around the world. So you would want to be aware of not just American-based holidays, but international, like holidays that happen in different religions. So for instance, you wouldn't want to schedule things in the middle of Hanukkah. Um, or you wouldn't want to schedule things in the Muslim religion during Eid. And so it's important to be aware of these major holidays when you're scheduling. And also, something that's really important that a lot of people miss is it's important to be cognizant of other events happening in your area. So in Portland, if you're scheduling something that's happening on the same day as the Rose Parade, chances are pretty high you won't have many people there because a major event is happening in Portland on that same day. So you don't want to be competing with other events that are happening in your geographic area. So when you're selecting a location, so I am really keeping this focused primarily on in-person events because those have more logistics around them versus an online event. So when you're selecting a location, there's a lot of different elements to selecting a location. So for instance, you need to consider if you want to have a hybrid event, meaning that people who are online are able to access the event that's happening in person, you really need to spend a lot of attention on how you're going to manage the online component. It's not just as easy as turning on a Zoom room and letting people observe, because there's a lot of management of the Zoom room. There's a lot of perhaps visual aids someone will need to see. So really paying attention to those aspects. Now, a really important aspect of the physical location that you choose is to ensure that's accessible to all. And so by that, I mean age requirements. So you wouldn't want to host an event at perhaps a bar or winery if you're trying to attract like families with children, right? Because those may have age requirements to get in. You also want to make sure that there are multiple transportation options, and I feel like in the Portland Metro, I can say that. You want to ensure that there are transportation options, public transportation options to get to that location. So, for example, here in Portland, the Expo Center is accessible by a lot of different trains, a lot of different buses. And the reason for that is that it's easy to the easier you make it get to, the more people will show up to that location, right? Now, something else that's really important that's often overlooked is the ADA compliance of a facility. So when I say ADA compliance, I mean the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the Americans with Disabilities Act has certain guidelines for physical spaces and online spaces, but physical spaces to make them accessible to individuals. So some common ADA compliant elements of a facility that you'd want to look for is ensuring that people in mobility assistance devices are able to access the facility. So are there ramps there? Are there elevators if there's a second floor? Are the bathrooms big enough to accommodate mobility assistance devices? So those are, and like there's things like, are the doors wide enough? So really when you're talking to potential venues, it's important to ask them about their ADA compliance. So you don't have to look for it yourself, just ask them what they offer. You also want to consider cost. So a lot of spaces do cost money to rent them. So you need to consider if your allotted budget is conducive with the space rental costs. And something else when you're considering a physical location is to consider where people already gather. So if you're trying to outreach in your community, say you're trying to outreach in your surrounding community, thinking about, well, where are areas where people are already gathering? Are there churches in your area? Are there community centers in your area? So trying to essentially make things easier on groups of people by just planning your event at that area. So especially if the goal is to get a lot of folks in, booking your event somewhere that's frequented by a lot of people, where you can also advertise that event in the weeks leading up to it, would be a really strategically advantageous thing to do. So we're going to get deeper into tracking expenses, but when you're creating an event budget, it's important to start out with an idea of how much you are willing to spend on the event. You can certainly adjust it, but here are some things that you may not consider just at the top of your head. They're things I don't really consider normally when thinking about planning an event. So first things first, supply costs. So supply costs, those can be like kind of sleeper expenses if you're not keeping track of them. So keeping track of how much things like printing or name tags cost, if you need tickets, if you need wristbands, how much do those things cost? Marketing costs. So how much does it cost to print things? If you're sending things out, say you're posting flyers, how much does that cost? How much does it cost to advertise the event if that's part of your goal? It's also important to consider food and beverage costs. Those can add up really quickly, especially if you are trying to accommodate large crowds. It's also important to consider how much the physical amenities will cost. So things like this, renting the space. In some cases, you may have to also rent tables and chairs or porta potties. So especially if you're doing an outdoor oriented event. So say you plan to do an event in the park, you're likely going to the park blocks, you're likely going to have to provide a lot of the physical amenities along with the event location because of the event location. Also, you have to consider licensing. So if you're planning on offering alcohol, you do have to apply, and I'm keeping this Portland specific, but like through the city of Portland, you would have to apply and obtain a special event license in order to serve alcohol at an event. And finally, considering the fees that speakers and panelists may be charging you. So say you are having like some kind of forum or perhaps a workshop, big wink there. You have to really consider how much are the people I'm engaging with charging for this event. Can you all think of any other costs that maybe I missed? So I would say this is a funny one, but one time I scheduled an event called Puppy Palooza. And so we also had to figure out supplies related to tarps and tents for the event. So okay, we have something in the chat. Insurance. Yeah, Lindsay, that's a great point. So if you don't have insurance and or event related insurance, depending on what type of event you're having, insurance may be an important component of the event if there's risk involved. Another one that actually just joggled in my mind, security. So if you need security for an event, generally you do have to pay a company to provide security for that event. So other things to consider when you're preparing that budget is how many people do you expect to attend? So what are your audience goals? What are your goals for attendees? What's the maximum amount of money you are willing to spend? So, you may need to adjust and say, oh, okay, the space rental is actually 200 more than we allocated. You need to consider how much of that you're willing to do. So maybe developing a range of how much you're willing to spend. It's also important to consider how you're allocating funds. So you can, obviously move the way you allocate funds up and down depending on how it plays out. But say you initially were like, okay, we only need $100 for supplies and we're doing 500 for food. That is the way, that's an allocation of the money. And also if you're doing like a fundraiser or if it's you're having people pay for the event, it's also important to consider the amount of expected revenue. So, in the past, I helped organize a 5K race. And so when I organized that, it was a fundraiser. And so we had to balance, it was a careful balance of determining how much we're spending on things like food and course markers, printing. So we had to balance that with how much money we expected to get because we still wanted to come up with money. We wanted to come out of it with money raised for the cause that we were trying to raise funds for. So. Okay, so now that you were envisioning that you're pretty certain on how much you're going to spend, you have your committee, everyone's clear on what they're going to do moving forward. You started scoping out a location. You have a pretty solid idea of what this event's going to start looking like. So now we're moving into the more nitty gritty. So the planning of it. So I mentioned earlier that the budget, right? So this is just a sample example, that rhymes, of how you can track your event costs. So I did prepare an event planning packet that will have a blank budget for you to start tracking your costs that you can use when you start planning events that I'll provide at the end. But this is just a sample budget tracking sheet. So it doesn't need to be super fancy, but basically you want to keep track of the item. And so you'll notice here, I put the items under major kind of buckets. So I have space costs, food costs, marketing costs, just to keep track, especially if you have people working on different things, you would kind of want to keep track of this separately. So we'll just go down the line. So say you're renting space, say you're quoted at $125 an hour and you need it for 2 hours. Well, that's going to cost you $250. Say you also need to rent tables. That's $100 a table. You need 5 tables. That's $500. So as you can see, it can start adding up if you're not keeping track of it. So, like I said, this is just a very basic budget, but it really starts helping you track. Okay, so say you had $500 allocated for food and beverage. You've already committed to $320. So you have roughly $180 left to spend on catering. So it just helps you kind of keep track of what you're spending and also gives you a reference for versus how much you allocated. So it helps you also see what's possible. Okay, so I would strongly suggest self-promotion here that you also look at Southeast Uplift's video on volunteer management to get deeper into volunteer management. But we're going to talk a little bit about volunteer needs for the day of an event. So as you start planning your event, it's important to keep track of the different tasks that you think you may need help with. This will help you with eventual volunteer recruitment. So some just very basic tasks I could think of that's more general is set up and tear down. So who's setting up all those tables that we just rented? Who's taking them down? Who has the physical ability to do that? People who are greeters. So if you're having an event where people need to greet folks and give them instructions on what to do next, you also may need to have people supervising certain activities depending on the event, and you may need help distributing that food. So you just bought 100 tacos. how do you give those tacos out? So really thinking through what types of needs you're going to have is going to really help you with your eventual recruitment. So when you are recruiting volunteers, it's important to follow these best practices. Make sure that the tasks and responsibilities required of them are clearly stated so they know what they need to do and essentially when they need to do it, which is related to shift time. So make sure that your shift times include breaks. So I have volunteered for events that had me working for like 4 hours straight with no breaks because no one really considered that. Like I just said, make sure physical requirements are specified. So if you do need some strong people to help with some very physical aspects of the event, make sure that's clear. And list the benefits of volunteering. So for instance, do they get a free event t-shirt? Are you going to feed them? What are some other things that they'll get out of helping you with the event? And it's always, always, always important to assign a backup person to each volunteer task. So I think I have it here in a second, but basically it's not unusual for people to not show up for a volunteer shift that they've signed up for. And in that case, especially with an event that needs to run with volunteer labor, it's always important to ensure that you have a backup because life happens, right? People can get sick, all kinds of things can happen. So it's always important just to make sure you have a backup assigned to that task. That way, if someone does end up calling in sick, someone else is already prepared to volunteer. So when we consider marketing your event, here are just some very basic ways you can market and outreach your event. Like I said, this is all very broad. It really depends on your specific event, but the use of social media. So posting about it on different social media websites, using already existing email lists. So say your organization has a list of emails from folks, send it out to them. Word of mouth, so letting people know, including it in newsletters, creating flyers for those events and posting them in physical spaces, and also advertising your event online in different areas. So like websites and stuff like that. These are all different options you can employ when you market your event. Okay, now we're going to talk about carrying out the event. So this is, I would say, the days leading up to the event. So this could be the week before, days before, 2 weeks before, whenever. But first things first, it's always important to maintain communication with the volunteers that you have coming for the event. So you'll need to make sure that you're confirming that they are still available. You'll need to provide relevant details and materials and instructions to them. So I recently helped with an event where someone provided me with a little laminated card telling me exactly what I need to do. So making sure that everyone who is helping is clear on the actual step-by-step instructions related to the task they've agreed to do. And also you need to assign a point of contact along with providing their contact information. That way, if I'm a volunteer and I'm confused, I need to know who I can talk to. Like say I'm kind of in a bind because I'm met with this situation I didn't know how to deal with. Who can I call or who's my point of contact that I can perhaps yell at and say, hey, Jim, I need your help. To come over and help. So not only does that help the volunteer, but on the event planning side, that also helps the point of contact be clear that they are going to be expected to provide that assistance to the volunteers. And the amounts of point of contacts you have can differ depending on the event. So say you're doing like a carnival, I'm just making something up. Say you're having a school carnival, you would probably want a point of contact for food. You'd probably want a point of contact for the games. You'd probably want a point of contact for the tickets. So it's really, like I said, it's really adjustable based on the context of your event. Okay, now we're at post-event. So say you have carried out your event, you did it, it's great. Now what do you do? So first things first, you want to make sure that you are tying loose ends. So are your remaining invoices paid? Are your thank you sent out to folks? Did you post your event pictures on your website, on social media, etc.? Really making sure that you wrap up the existing aspects, the aspects of the event that still remain. Then it's important, and this is an often overlooked aspect of event planning. It's important to reflect and process on how the event went. So these are just some general questions, but I recommend hosting one more meeting with your event planning committee where you really reflect on what went well, what didn't go as well, what didn't work. And if you are going to have this event again, reflecting on what adjustments you would make. So I strongly suggest ensuring that this is all well documented. I think every phase of this should be well documented. That way, you don't have to start from scratch moving forward. So say you do have this event, say it's an annual thing, or you have a similar event. Having all this documented can help you make those adjustments to make the event more successful or flow more smoothly. If you did make if you wanted to make adjustments, but it also just gives some great feedback to folks. Like, so say I'm brand new and I want to help plan an event. Well, if I look through the stuff you did to plan an event before, I have a pretty good idea of a budget. I have a pretty good idea of what types of supplies I may need. And I have a pretty good idea of, you know, what all is going into that event. And so on that note, I highly recommend that you follow essentially the tenets of making an event planning packet. So, or working through this event planning packet, I should say. So I'm going to link it for you all. So you, through that link, you can make your own event planning, your own copy of an event planning packet. And then I'm just going to show you what it looks like. So basically, this follows the 4 phases of event planning. So creating the event. So you start by listing your committee members, then you clarify everyone's role, name and their role. And, you know, one person can have more than one role, but it's really important to ensure you have a working knowledge of who is responsible for what. That way nothing gets left in the cracks, right? So then there's also, and this could all be full discussions. This could all be like hour-long discussions in an event planning meeting, right? But keeping track of what the goal is, what the target audience is, determining a time and date. This all looks very simple, right? But like I said, I've sat in a meeting just a few weeks ago where we spent an hour discussing, well, about 45 minutes discussing the goal of an event. So we were like, should this be more networking or should this just be for fun? How should we do this event? Yeah, and then confirming the time and date. So making sure everyone, at least in the committee, can make it, and then thinking through those holidays, things like that, determining location. Then this is just a quick event budget that you can use to plan out and get a kind of scaffolding of what you want your event budget to look like. So this gets into planning the event. So this is where you would list what you plan to do in the event. Now, I also have run of show here. So run of show would be, I would say probably a separate kind of document you would need to be, if it's a very formal event, a run of show is essentially very long, not, it doesn't have to be very long, but it's very detailed outline of how things are running. So if you have more of a structured event, it would be really important to do things like planning out stuff like this. Here, I'll write it down. So like so introductions of attendees. So when you're doing a run of show, you'd be like, all right, so that's going to take about 20 minutes for everyone to introduce themselves. We have a 2-hour event. So it's already a sixth of your event gone, right? A sixth of your event done. So then say speaker number 1. So, okay, how many minutes should we give? Let's give them 15 minutes. Okay, we have 3 speakers. So that ends up being an hour and 5 minutes. So speaker 2, 15 minutes. Speaker 3, 2 minutes. So then as you're developing this, it gives you pretty much an idea of what you can expect in terms of time. And it really kind of helps you think through how much time you do need to budget for the event. So just kind of developing an outline related to that. Volunteer tasks needed. So this can come up at multiple points. So you can always go back to a section. It's not as linear as I made it seem, right? But as you start thinking through the different activities you're going to have, keeping a list of what volunteer tasks you will need will be really important. That way you're not scrambling at the end, like when the event's getting closer to say, oh shoot, we forgot that we need somebody to pick up trash at the end or something like that. So this is where you would start keeping track of volunteers. You can obviously add to this this form. You can make a separate form. These are just examples, but some primary things you would need from them initially would be things like contact information. This is where you would keep track of the different supplies and services that you need. This is where you keep track of how you plan to market the event. Then here is a whole page for keeping track of your event costs. Then here is how stuff related to carrying out the event. So who's the point of contact? So that way you can just keep track. Now this is designed with essentially the idea that you would be working through this as an event planning committee, which, it could be 2 of you, but this helps you kind of keep track of things and dialogue around these different elements. Volunteer management. So this is just a very basic type of spreadsheet that you could use. So you keep track of the task. So say setting up tables. Let's just think this one through. So with setting up tables, I would need to set up tables probably at the beginning of the event. Let's say I'm having an event 5 to 7. I need someone, if the event's from 5 to 7, I need them there at 4 to set up tables. So I would say 4 to 5. Volunteer. I'm just gonna make up a name. We'll say Jen's gonna do it. And then let's say Jessica's gonna be backup. Now, then I'm thinking through, okay, well, we have the table set up, so who's gonna take them down? So then take down tables. So the event goes from 7 until 7. I probably won't be asking people to break down the tables until 7:30. So whoever volunteers needs to be sure that they are available at 7:30 to come break it down. So let's say 7:30, 8:30. So this starts giving you an idea of the fact that the event runs from a certain time doesn't necessarily mean that that's when you need your volunteers. You need your volunteers at different times. So say you're doing food, setting up food, you'd probably want someone there by, I don't know, probably 3:30 or 4. So this kind of helps you think through all the time that's going into the before and after of an event. Now, post-event, like I said, I strongly recommend having at least one separate meeting just to talk about what did we think of the event? And so just really reflecting for posterity. And then, so imagine you filled all this out over the months. Now you would have a complete packet and a complete artifact of the event that you held. So then say you move away, say you exit your job, say you no longer volunteer, someone else would be able to form a committee and kind of follow what you did. So that's the goal with this. All right, so thank you, everybody. We'll go ahead and just open it up for questions, for discussion.
Could you talk a bit about smaller events that don't involve as much planning, that you might expect to have like 5 to 10 people? Well, this is a perfect example right here. This is an event. So, but not something that involves a committee or, So could you talk a bit about smaller events?
Yeah, like, well, let's debrief on even this event, right?
Yeah,
So
right.
with this event, Lindsay and I met to discuss what's the goal of the event. So Lindsay, right, had to secure a speaker to do a workshop, right? So we had a meeting to discuss what do you want out of this event? What do you expect? And then from there, we negotiated when is Southeast Uplift available? When am I available? And so one thing Lindsay did was looked at the Southeast Uplift calendar and said, oh, there's like a neighborhood association meeting on this day. There's this event on this day. So those aren't good days. And I was looking at my calendar going, oh, there's this event on this day. So that's not going to work for me. So then from there, we negotiated, right? So there was actually a lot of planning that went into this event. Now from there, then Lindsay had to create, and this is just an online event, right? She had to create, well, we jointly created a description of the event. So what is the actual event that we're planning? What are the elements? Then on my end, right, I had to create slides. Lindsay had to create a Zoom registration link, had to send that out to people. So all that marketing that goes into that. And then, Also, we have to consider accessibility needs. So do we have captioning on for this event? And this is online, right? But that's a lot that can go into such a small event. Did I miss anything, Lindsay, to that event planning?
That sounds like most of it.
Yeah, I spent my past 2 days creating slides for the event, creating that worksheet, so creating materials for the event. So yeah. Now, if it's like a smaller in-person event, I'd still probably, I would say some of those elements still apply. So you want to always make sure that you're feeding people as much as you can, or at least providing some kind of refreshment. You also need a secure space. You need to think, okay, how far out, even if it's just 10 of us, that's very difficult to get 5 to 10 people together in a room at once, right? I'm very proud this group did it. Look at these folks. But getting people together, right? You need to think through, okay, well, what's everybody's availability? When would be the best time to do it? All right, dinner webinar. We love that. Great. So then they had to figure out who's bringing what, right? So they all planned to be somewhere. They said, hey, who's coming? Who's bringing what? Who's in charge of what? Whose computer are we going to use? So there is like kind of a lot that could go even in the smallest of events. Hi, Lance. What kind of questions do you have?
Hello. Well, we called in a little late, so I don't know if you covered this earlier. Do you have any guidelines or, I guess specifically around city permits? We've done some outside events where we'll like do the noise permit, but there's been some like discussion around whether or not we need fire and special events permits. And on one hand, I've heard people say, oh, if it's like a commercially rated building with like sprinklers, then no problem.
Portland.
Yes, that is true. Prosper Portland did tell us we didn't need a special events permit for a space because it was sprinklered, and that did not line up with what the fire department said. So I was just curious if y'all had any kind of go-bys or thoughts on that, for spaces that are open to the public spaces typically, but like enclosed, I guess. So they may not need a special events permit in the way that we would like notify the neighborhood if we were throwing a street fair. So yeah, I was just curious like what y'all's flavor of guidance on that is.
I mean, you just mentioned some very important people, so I wouldn't want to say like, don't listen to them. But yeah, I would probably, I don't have any specific guidance on that. Let me start there. But what I would say is being clear on the activities of your event and what your event is probably goes a long way in negotiating that, right? So in some situations, if an event is open to the broader public, right, you would say, yeah, we've identified our target audience as the broad public, which they'll probably say, you need these permits, right? Now, if you did, oh, our audience is only invitation only, you may not need those events because it could maybe be considered more of a private event. You know, like food handling permits, stuff like that apply more if you're broad public, general public. But if it's invite only, you could probably argue, I mean, I'm being recorded right now, but you could probably argue it's more of a private event because there's an assumption of risk involved with the folks who came.
Okay, that is actually really, really helpful because I've been kind of unclear on where the line is. Like I have some friends that throw a yard party and they were joking with me. They were like, oh, should we get a noise permit? And I was like, actually, probably. But again, like it's very murky, and no one's ever complained before. So I guess they're fine.
Yeah. Well, with that, I think it's also just being clear on the general, like noise. Like there's certain hours you're not supposed to make noise in neighborhoods, right? So just kind of adhering to that probably is a good first step. But if you feel like, oh no, we're going to be very loud beyond that, you may need to apply for a permit. I'm not a lawyer though, so. All right, someone speaking? You all are muted, so I didn't know if someone else was saying something. You all are speaking to each other, probably, maybe.
Oh, so actually, I have a follow-up question. You mentioned like local promotion, and I loved the idea of choosing a space that's already a common space for folks because you can directly recruit of people physically being there. One of the observations I've seen, mostly from folks with like ticketed events, has been that the virtual like social media publicity hasn't been as useful, and they're like really leaning into like postering. So I was curious if y'all had heard anything about that. Yeah, it was an interesting observation post pandemic, to say, you know, hey, my virtual marketing is actually working much lower than it was previously. And they're kind of like transitioning tactics.
Yeah, and I think that gets really into who are you trying to reach. So, you know, if you're trying to reach folks who aren't naturally using social media, then social media is not your best bet. So, for instance, are you trying to reach youth? Are you only using Facebook to advertise your events? Probably not the best venue, right? So, I mean, social media marketing can really be really confusing because there are different groups that use different things, right? But one thing that lots of groups have in common is, so I go to PSU, you know, PSU is filled with college students who are passing these flyers and posters all the time, right? So I could sit around and be like, are you on TikTok? Are you on Instagram? What would you use, right? But if I'm trying to recruit, or if I'm trying to get a lot of college students there, I'll just put it up at their college, because then they'll see it, they'll take a picture of it. Now that's something that I see more often now is with youth, is they just take a picture of a flyer instead of responding to stuff that's posted online. Because I think there is, to your point, like a lot of that online fatigue. So I am a big proponent of posting physical flyers in spaces that are frequented by the groups you are trying to reach. So if they're naturally congregating, like say you're trying to reach a big group of folks in your community, and perhaps they go to church, ask if you can post on a church bulletin board. There's senior centers in your area or community centers, posted on those. Senior centers, the reason why I'm mentioning that, they're not going to be they're not going to be on Instagram looking for events, right? So you could use a multimodal kind of plan, but you know, you may want to budget for, okay, we're trying to reach everyone in Lents. Let's just go ahead and pay the 50 cents a postcard to send it to every address in Lents, which is, you know, that's a possibility. The city of Milwaukee actually physically sends newsletters every month to every Milwaukee resident. They put that in their budget specifically to make sure they're reaching everybody. So it just really depends on your goals. Is that a dog?
There's a whole cast of characters here tonight.
Oh, that's great. That's wonderful.
There's another one, but he's looking mournfully at us from a blanket.
My cat's just side-eyeing me saying, why do you keep talking to this box, Mom? So.
We missed intros, but Molly, where are you from, I guess? Just in the spirit of networking across East Portland.
Oh, Molly, you're muted.
Okay. Yeah, Sunnyside East Village. It's an organization that is trying to help older people stay in their homes, age in place.
Is that a 1591 behind you?
A what?
Your sewing machine, is that a 1591? I can't quite see it.
It is. I think it's a 1590 actually.
1590. Okay.
Vintage.
Well, close. I couldn't tell from the back. So.
That's so cool. So Molly makes quilts and is currently working on one to go to a summer camp for kids affected by bereavement.
Oh,
wonderful.
wow.
Oh, look at the owls.
That's awesome.
Love it.
That's owl red.
Great.
Yeah. All right, what other questions can I answer in the 10 minutes we have left?
I think on the side, we're pretty squared away. We were feeling very validated because we've kind of homegrown some like file structures and things that we now like copy paste over for projects. So we were
That's
like,
wonderful.
okay, we're on the right track.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. There's no point, especially when it comes to event planning, if you're planning similar events, there's no reason to try to reinvent the wheel, especially if you have a good infrastructure to what you're already doing. We'll be sending the slides out, so anything that you feel you may have missed will be covered on those slides. And also there's a recording, I guess, that you can also revisit. All right. Well, if there aren't any questions right now, I'll just go ahead. I'm posting my email address in the chat for those of you here. And then let me go ahead and I guess I should show a quick screen with that for those of you who are not here. If I can find that screen again. Maybe not. Maybe we're just giving up. But basically
Oh, I was gonna say, actually, while you're looking, the one thing I would comment on is we were kind of talking about how for like the group that we generally volunteer with, we never sell tickets to anything, which means we are often doing all of our projects on a grant by grant basis. So part of the postmortem and like the strategy that we have is know what your grant report looks like before you even start the project, so that we actually have folders where we collect everything. We collect the statistics that we want, that we have to deliver at the end, like starting from day one. And like, that's part of
Perfect.
the plan. Yeah, because that's a huge piece of, if you're not gonna, charge money for things, you have to be able to report out on them.
And
So
your grant report is basically done when you're finished with the project.
because you've just rolled it all
Wonderful.
up. So that's the one tip to slide in.
Yeah,
but
keeping track of
depending on
like
what kind of group.
demographics, attendees,
Yeah.
that's one
Yep.
that makes my program evaluation heart happy. So something I do in my day job is program evaluation. So here's my email address for those of you who are watching online. So feel free to reach out. All right. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate your flexibility as we worked through everything today. Lindsay will be sending out these materials, but yeah, I hope everyone has a great rest of your evening. Enjoy the rest of your dinner together, Lentz neighborhood.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks.
This was great.
Yeah, thank you, Diane.
Thank you, Diane.
Take care, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Okay, bye-bye.